Welcome to Your Source TV. I'm Tamara Stuchlak, and in this segment, we're speaking with Pat Wirth, who is the Executive Director of the Turning Point Suffragist Memorial. Pat, welcome. We're so pleased to have you here. And I'd like to start with your background on your passion for supporting this honoring of women through a memorial and through this organization.
Well, thank you for the question, because I don't usually get asked that question. I was actually an entrepreneur in the automotive service business for over 35 years. But the beautiful benefit of being an entrepreneur is your business gives you a platform to give back to the community that keeps you successful. And when I sold my business in 2013, and I had been very active in nonprofits, I went back and took classes to become a certified nonprofit specialist. And I ran into this particular organization not ever intending to do away with my own business, but the more I heard about this organization and I learned about the organization and I learned about what it stood for and the history about it, I was very compelled to get involved. One of the suffragist leaders was Alice Paul, and she was a Quaker from New Jersey. Well, I happen to be from New Jersey, and when I heard about what she had done and what women had done, and I was learning more and more and more, I got kind of angry to think that I had been raised in New Jersey and never heard of this woman.
And the whole history of women.
Yes, exactly.
In our country.
Exactly.
And the 72-year battle for rights.
That's correct.
So tell us more about this mission and why the memorial, the Suffragist Memorial.
Well, our mission is to educate, inspire, and empower present and future generations to remain vigilant in the quest for equal rights, because that's what these women were all about. And in fact, the beginning of the suffragist movement took place in 1848 in Seneca Falls, New York, and it was the first women's rights convention in our country. And at the end of that two-day convention, there were 300 people there, men and women. They came up with a document called the Declaration of Sentiments, and it was based loosely on the Declaration of Independence. And the platform of the document, the very first thing, was suffrage for women, because they understood that if they didn't have rights under the law and the vote, they were limited to what they could actually do. And it took over 5 million women, 72 years, they kept persevering until the vote was won in 1920.
And so during this time, you know, our grandmother's time, there were no independent rights for women. Not after marriage, not after divorce, no college education, really opportunities.
Well, the first, I'd say 50 years of the movement segued into what we call the progressive era, which was 1890 to 1920. And during that period of time, they weren't successful in achieving suffrage, but little by little, they started achieving some of the other things. And so by the end of the 19th century, women were finally allowed to go to college. So they were getting some further education. And different states' rights were changing somewhat, because in 1848, if you were married, you were civilly dead. You were property of your husband. And so little by little, these changes came about because these women who were just phenomenal. I mean, not only were they fighting for suffrage, they were fighting for, they were abolitionists against slavery. They were temperance, they were against drinking, and the reason for that is back in the day in 1848, if you were married and your husband drank, and a lot of men did at the time, and he wanted to beat you, that was perfectly okay within the law because you were his property. And if he didn't really like you, he could have you put into an institution, and a mental institution, and you couldn't get out. I mean, those were the kind of crazy things of how the law allowed that sort of thing. So little by little, over the first 50 years of the movement, those things began to change somewhat, so that at the turn of the century, women had more rights, but they still were unable to vote. And particularly women that were involved in a lot of the progressive organizations. Unions had begun for women who were working, and the PTA was started in the 1800s, and the General Federation of Women's Clubs had started. But they recognized that without a vote, they could only accomplish so much. They couldn't affect the laws that affected what they were working on.
And there also was a significant picketing event at the White House that is tied into having this suffragist memorial at the Lorton Occoquan workhouse location here in Northern Virginia.
That's absolutely correct. In 1917, when then President Woodrow Wilson again refused to do anything insofar as Congress was concerned in a national amendment, Alice Paul's organization, the National Women's Party, decided to start picketing the White House. And they picketed from Monday through Saturday from 10 in the morning until 6 in the evening in all kinds of weather. And in mid-1917, Woodrow Wilson started having them put in jail. And those that were unfortunate enough to be sent to the Occoquan workhouse in Lorton were housed in inhumane conditions. They were beaten, they were tortured, they were force-fed. And when a group was sent there in November of 2017, there were 34 of them, the superintendent was waiting for these women to come, and he had brought in Marines from Quantico. And they dragged the women across the street, put them into punishment cells, tortured them. And when word leaked out, it became the turning point in the movement because it forced Wilson to go to Congress. Pretty horrible story. Most people don't know this. This information, this story, this whole movement about the suffrage movement is not found in our textbooks today.
Why do you suppose that's the case? What have you found as you've been
I can tell you
promoting?
Exactly. I can tell you exactly why. What our premier historian says, and this is a direct quote from her: "The white men who wrote the history books didn't think it was important, and they left it out." So it's not there. It's not there today either. You might find a paragraph about the suffrage movement, and you'll find a picture of Susan B. Anthony because the amendment was named after her.
The 19th Amendment.
The 19th Amendment was named after her, so inappropriately so. I mean, she dedicated her entire life to the suffrage movement, but she actually died a dozen years before we got the vote. So she unfortunately did not live to see it to fruition. But it's still, there's very little information.
So hence the mission of the memorial is also continuing education and really the fight for equal rights in terms of the history books as well as the ERA. So talk a little bit about that.
Well, we are intending to establish a Turning Point Institute once the memorial is built, and we're fundraising for that. We're intending to establish a Turning Point Institute for young women from across the country, middle and high school, and we are going to be putting together programming. We already have major organizations that are going to be involved with doing that, and our goal is to provide them with information on leadership, public speaking, but we want our programs to be a turning point for them so that they understand that when there is a need for change or they feel that they want to see change, that they have to be intentional and they have to get involved. You don't go to bed at night and the next morning because you dreamed you wanted something to happen, it's going to happen.
So you want to give young women the tools and others, and also it ties into the memorial design and the location in terms of there's 19 educational stations.
Yes.
And tell us a little bit more about the design and the location.
Well, the architect is Robert Beach, and he is actually a member of the Fairfax County History Commission. Every element in the design has a specific historic purpose tied to the suffrage movement. And there are 19 informational stations that will tell the entire 72-year history.
And as we're coming to a close, what are some key aspects that you find that women, men, as you go around and you're fundraising,
yes,
that are unique to fundraising for a woman's cause?
Well, the biggest problem, quite frankly, the biggest problem that I have is that people don't know the history. They don't know the story. So it's very hard to say, we would like for you to donate money to this memorial, and people are going, okay. They really have no idea about the
historical significance.
The historical significance, yes, which these women engineered the greatest expansion of democracy in a single day that the world had ever seen. And
22 million?
Yep, 22 million women were guaranteed the right to vote. Not all of them got that right on day one because, if you were an American Indian, it was a couple years later, that sort of thing. And African American women, although they got the legal right, they were hampered because of Jim Crow laws, poll taxes, and things of that nature. But nonetheless, the right was there. It just took a little more time, particularly for African American sisters, until the civil rights movement in the 60s. But nonetheless, yeah, it was huge accomplishment for democracy in our country.
So Pat, as we're coming to a close, any final comments before we bring on Bonnie Kyte, who's also going to join us, and her grandmother was a direct descendant of...
Yes, her grandmother was a suffragist.
She was a suffragist.
Yeah.
Any final comments?
Well, I hope people will realize that this memorial will not build itself. We are a 501c3 nonprofit. We are looking for support. I'm more than willing to provide presentations, literature, information, because part of the challenge is to educate others about what we're trying to do. I have found that when most people have heard nothing about this, and so they're pretty struck that it's like the same thing for me. Why did I never hear about this? Why did I not know about this history? So that's one of the challenges we have, but I'm willing to go anywhere and follow any lead anyone chooses to give me to help us get to our goal of $2 million.
Fantastic. So let's get behind this very important historical memorial, and we'll be right back. Welcome back to Your Source TV, and with us is Bonnie Kyte, who is a strong supporter of the Suffragist Memorial, the Turning Point Suffragist Memorial. And Bonnie, tell us why you're a passionate supporter and why you want this fundraising to succeed.
Well, my grandmother was a suffragette up in New York City, a marching suffragette. She wasn't imprisoned as the women in Virginia here at the Turning Point, but I believe that women need to understand that it's been such a short period of time, less than 100 years, that we had rights.
Our grandparents.
My grandmother, my mother and father, when they bought a house in Maryland in the 50s, my mother couldn't sign for the loan. She couldn't be put on the mortgage. And she was a working woman.
And then when credit cards came in, women were
she
not allowed
couldn't
to
get
have
a credit card.
Yes.
People don't understand this.
Yes.
We need to help others to know the history, to get out there and vote, get more women in the Senate and Congress. Let's get there.
And what activities are you doing locally here? I know you're part of an executive women's networking association. And
Yes.
Tell us what you're doing to promote other women and others getting behind the memorial.
I'm a lifetime member of the American Association of University Women, and we sponsor any and all events, acts. We Senate, Congress, we march on Capitol Hill all the time for women's rights.
So this is an extension of that work you've been doing for many years.
Absolutely. Do you realize that the Equal Pay Amendment has not passed even half of the states? Equal pay. I mean, women, we need to get out there.
Thank you, Bonnie, for your comments, and you also, Pat. And joining us after the break will be two local supporters of the Turning Point Suffragist Memorial. Welcome back to Your Source TV. And in this segment, we're speaking to two local active supporters of the Turning Point Suffragist Memorial and their active participation in developing this memorial in the Northern Virginia region. So, Stephane Scarola, please share with us your passion, and I know you come from the Tower Club, an executive business association, and you're leading the Women to Women project.
Yeah, thank you very much, Tamara. So I guess being half Dominican and Italian, passion is my middle name. So, you know, one of the reasons that I got involved with this is a couple things. One is I'm a first-generation American, and so the right to vote is a fundamental right, in my opinion. And for women to not have had the right to vote and only to have achieved it in less than 100 years ago is incredible to me. Yes. And actually, my grandmother just passed away last week, and it was during her lifetime. She was 105. So the right to vote is a fundamental right. Women's rights are human rights. And I value that very, very much so. But about a year and a half ago, I went to go hear Pat speak, and she gave Pat Wirth, and she gave a talk about the Suffragist Memorial, and there was another historian there from the Smithsonian Institution, and we left there not only enriched with the history.
With your daughter?
With my stepdaughter, Ainsley, and not only was it, we were enriched with the history of the Suffragist Memorial, or the suffragist movement itself, but we were enraged. So enraged that you know, this history isn't really widely known. And not only that it happened, but it's not widely known. It's still not in the history books. You really have to seek it out. And
which is part of the association, is to really promote that and educate.
Yes, and I think, you know, what's fundamental, what draws me in to the memorial is not only is it a memorial in stone or what have you to the women, the 5 million women that fought 72 years for the right to vote, but it also is a living memorial to them in that it will provide education and what have you. And so, you know, and it really sort of speaks to me because throughout my career, I've grown up in a male-dominated industry.